I'm Kasey. I'm an atheist and I'm openly secular. My story begins as being raised by Jehovah's Witness parents. My dad came from a long line of Jehovah's Witnesses. I think he's related to some of the first followers of the Watchtower. My mom converted. A little background on my mom, she was her mother's third child, and her mother had her when she was 18 and then had 6 more kids. So her mom, you could say, was not prepared at 18 to have 3 kids. So my mom grew up a lot in foster care and spent time in juvie and, you know, had a rough life. She was ran across by my grandma on my dad's side out in service. She was doing the preaching work out in service and found my mom. And my mom was searching, and she quickly converted to becoming a Jehovah's Witness. She then married my dad, and my sister and I were identical twins. We were born within a year of their marriage. We had never known anyone who wasn't a Jehovah's Witness when we entered public school. So kindergarten was our first experience with non-witnesses. And kindergarten, I think, is probably a little different for Jehovah's Witness kids because, you know, you're taught from as early as you can remember that Armageddon is imminent, and everyone who's not one of Jehovah's people is going to die in Armageddon. So when you go to kindergarten and you realize that you're surrounded by kids who aren't witnesses and that they're all going to die really soon, that's a lot of pressure. And school is really hard because on the one hand you've been taught Armageddon is about to happen, and on the other hand you're taught if you don't preach to these people that you're guilty of their death in Armageddon, which could happen at any second. But then you learn very quickly that preaching and proselytizing to children at public school is social death. So it's just like this emotional warfare that you have as a child. And then on top of that, you're also taught that school doesn't matter. You're legally required to go to school, and that the only thing that does matter is studying about Jehovah. And if you do end up going to college, like these worldly people who emphasize on going to college, you're just seeking your own glory and not God's glory. So, you know, your sole focus is on the end of the world and everyone dying. And that's your experience growing up. My sister and I got pretty rebellious by middle school. By high school, you know, it was kind of just a war between us and our parents for the most part. Although I will say my mom loved being our mom, and I think really likes us individually, and she was a good mom. She's just, you know, hoodwinked by this organization. So, to continue the story, my sister and I were both disfellowshipped in our early 20s. So that means no one that you've ever been around your entire life can ever talk to you ever again. So it's pretty cut and dry, and this is publicly announced. When my sister was disfellowshipped, a circuit overseer told my mom, when my mom was crying at the announcement, that she should feel actually blessed by Jehovah, because if we were living in the Israelite days, my sister would have been stoned to death and my mom would have had to cast the first stone. So my mom was really comforted by that. I'll give you like an example of what it's like being a young adult and without a family or any sort of support system to rely on. When I was also in my early 20s, I broke my arm, and I was a young mother. I had my baby when I was 21. My arm fused together, and my range of motion was like this. I had like a literal Barbie arm, and being that I always had to support my daughter, I couldn't get that fixed because I did not have anyone who was willing to help me. So I went almost 7 years like that, with my arm being able to move like this. And even when I had my arm fixed, there was a process that I had to go through. I had to be very creative to survive. At one point, I rented a room from a man who was a mechanical engineer at one point in his career. He retired after 9/11 and campaigned for like 11 years that the 9/11 was an inside job, and that you know, America was guilty of murder, and he felt really compelled to talk to people about this. When we got into the house, there was a picture of Karl Rove in handcuffs. Like, he was really obsessed with that. So this was not a man who was like shielding himself from controversy. And I remember one time I tried to talk to him about what I had been through with religion, and he like would not listen to it. He acted pretty offended by it, so I didn't talk to him about that ever again. But I have to say, he also had a wife that suffered horribly from cancer and died, so I think he was connected to belief in an emotional way, but whatever. Religion was not a topic we could discuss. There's other experiences where, like, you'd be amazed by how callous people are to your story from walking away from religion. I had a therapist tell me, well, she insinuated that religion and your lack of faith and becoming an atheist was connected with PTSD. And I felt like that was like a really passive-aggressive way to tell me that, you know, not trusting in Jesus, because she was a follower of Jesus Christ, was a sign of mental illness. I also had my best friend tell me I needed to just get over it because nobody fucking cares. And I know that's true. You know, like, fundamentalism isn't something that most people are aware exists, let alone knows what it feels like. And so to say goodbye to, like, your family and to be alone is something that I feel like people don't sympathize with that much, because no one understands how that can happen to you unless you did something to deserve it. People not being able to see, like, the deep-seated motivations behind people's actions, it's just amazing to me. That's why I love Sam Harris, because I feel like he's like the only person acknowledging that belief absolutely affects behavior, and those two are very connected. And you know, he's actually putting out a warning to the world and being, you know, kind of mocked for it and shit. And I don't get it. But I'm from a different perspective, because I understand the fundamentalist mind more than most people do, I feel like. So, anyway, yeah. I think that it's important to be open about your secular identity, because, you know, you may offend someone. You know, like, take for example when that, like, Duck Dynasty guy started talking openly about, you know, his morality based on scripture. You know, like, so many people were like, that came to my work because I'm a hairstylist, were like, oh yeah, I really appreciate that guy standing up for Christian values. And, you know, I even heard someone say that Christians were like an oppressed minority in our country. And, you know, it's just important to disagree with people like that, because what they believe is harmful. It is harmful to people. It's harmful to gay people. And why should we be so sensitive to their feelings about that? There's a really good book that helped me a lot, that I would recommend for people that are walking away from any type of group shunning or whatever, and that is Leadership and Self-Deception. And I think that book was actually written for businesses, and the whole thing is like an exercise, but it really helps you understand the process of cognitive dissonance, which is basically your subconscious protecting your ego from feeling embarrassed by being wrong. And that's something that human beings do. And reading that book actually gave me some compassion for like my family. And some gratitude that I'm not in that prison, and they are, and I wish they could get out of that prison. So I think that's being open about your secular self is important for society.